Hi, I'm Don Graves, President of the Gila Native Plant Society. In this first video, we're going to take a look at the great big diversity of pollinators. These are things that we hope that you'll be able to attract to your yard with your native plants as part of your landscaping project. So here they are. These are the major groups, 4 major groups. There are other pollinators. We're not talking about hummingbirds here, for example. So we have the Hymenoptera, which are the bees and the wasps. Actually, the Hymenoptera also includes the ants. The Diptera, which are the flies. The Lepidoptera, the butterflies and the moths. And then the Coleoptera are the beetles. Keep in mind, if you need to go back to the scientific terminology, scientific naming, these are all orders, major orders of pollinators. So let's take a look at some of these. Of course, this is in the Hymenoptera, the bees and the wasps. This is a bee, and very beautiful. This is a very, very small bee. This bee could not be identified because it has so much pollen on it. It's incredible. These hairs, at least on many bees, are specially adapted to hold on to pollen. This, of course, is a bumblebee, Bombus. This is one of the wasps. Look at that abdomen. And look at the space, that real great constriction between the last 2 body parts. This is actually one of our hawk wasps, perhaps a tarantula hawk wasp, the state insect of New Mexico, which will lay her egg in the body of an anesthetized tarantula, which she has caught and anesthetized, lays egg, buries the tarantula, and that developing larva will have a nice living food source. But the hawk wasp is not feeding on tarantulas and spiders. It's feeding on nectar. Another wasp, look at the constriction between the thorax and the abdomen. Now we're into the group of the flies, Diptera, 2 wings, unlike the other groups of pollinators, which have 4 wings. Another fly. Notice they don't have the pollen catching hairs, but they act as pollinators, feeding on nectar. Another fly. Now we're into the coleopterans, the beetles. If you can think of a lightning beetle or a June beetle, when they take off, one set of wings comes up, kind of like a shield, and then the wings underneath are the wings that actually do the flying. So they kind of look kind of funny when they take off. It's another beetle. You can see that it's dusted with pollen, but it's not there to eat pollen. Another beetle. Here you can see a little better that hard shell, and it's known as the elytra. They are known as the elytra, these 2 coverings, and they'll open kind of clumsily, and then the wings underneath will provide flight. Another beetle. Now we're in the lepidopterans, the butterflies and the moths. This is a little skipper. They're generally quite small. Once again, nectar feeders. You can see that long proboscis, which is going down into floral tubes. This, of course, is a monarch butterfly. Notice that on the middle wings there, not the large wings, but the ones just close to the center, off to the right and to the left, you see little dark black gland. That tells you that that monarch is a male. The females do not have that gland on the wing. This is the two-tailed swallowtail butterfly. Once again, the proboscis getting down into that long floral tube, feeding on nectar. This is a sphinx moth. You can see the proboscis out, feeding on nectar. Looks like salvia. Many of these sphinx moths will be active at night. Another moth. Let's take a real quick look at the life cycle of these pollinators. All four groups of these pollinators that we just talked about have the same type of life cycle. It's a metamorphosis because they're changing. They're metamorphosing from one stage to another. So this is what they call the complete metamorphosis: egg, larva, pupa, adult. So this is an example of a lepidopteran life cycle, butterflies and moths, but the beetles and the flies will be similar. So here's the adult. Adult is laying an egg. The egg is going to hatch into a larva, and the larva may molt 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8 times, getting bigger and bigger, shedding its outer covering every time. We know that as the caterpillar. And then the pupa will develop, and you think of the chrysalis in a monarch butterfly, that's the pupal stage. And then back into the adult. So here's the egg of a two-tailed swallowtail. Very small. You can see the leaf veins there and kind of get an idea. Maybe the size of a period in a typical book. Here is the caterpillar, or the larval stage. This is the larva of the two-tailed swallowtail. Here's the pupa. So that whole structure there is known as the chrysalis, but it's the pupal stage. And then, of course, the adult. So as I said, the bees and wasps, the beetles, and the flies all have this complete metamorphosis. Let's say you're something like a water bug. It's an insect that the adult will lay an egg, and then the egg will develop into what's sort of a mini adult. Doesn't have a larval stage. And then the mini adult, if you will metamorphose, well, actually will shed and go through several sheds until it gets to the size of an adult. So you see, that's not a complete. That would be an incomplete metamorphosis. So just a little bit different life cycle of these different orders of insects. So I'm not going to take time to read all of this, but if you know the lifespans of the insects, that might help you design some strategies to attract them. The flies and beetles don't live very long. Butterflies even less, a week or two. The solitary bees for up to a year. And most of this time is that metamorphosis from the egg to the larva to the adult. And then there are social bees, the bumblebees and honeybees would be examples. And so they go through she goes through a full year. She emerges lays eggs, mates, and overwinters. So here are some of the habitat needs, general categories of habitat needs. You think about your landscaping project, and you look at other successful landscaping projects, you're going to see that there's a great variety of plants, and these plants are going to be blooming over a long change of seasons, so that there is food or nectar or pollen available from spring until freeze up in the fall. Providing a variety of nesting sites is important, and then many species will overwinter, so we need to have some hibernation habitat for them. One of the things to keep in mind is that our most important pollinators are the bees. That's simply because they forage for pollen. Those other orders that we just talked about, they do not forage for pollen. They're nectar feeders, and they just happen to get pollen on them, so they're important, but the bees are the really important ones. So sort of something to think about, that you provide good habitat, variety of plants, good nesting sites for bees, and that will translate into suitable habitat for a whole variety of the other pollinators as well. So this is an example of a wildflower garden that has many different species in it. If you were to stand here in the spring and stand there through the fall, you would see that these plants are flowering, and then they'll be done flowering and something else will flower, and then it won't, and then it will die back and go to seed, and then so this whole transition from one group of flowering plants to another, so that we cover that whole year, the whole growing year. So where pollinators lay their eggs is important. You think of a butterfly, and it's going to lay its eggs on the plant that the caterpillar, the larva, is going to feed on. The beetles and the flies, maybe there's a rotten carcass, maybe there's a log that is decaying, and so that will provide food for the flies and the beetles. And then the bees and the wasps are in these brood cells in a nest chamber. So if it's it could be underground, it could be in a tube, it could be a nest chamber of an old rodent or something like that. But by knowing where these pollinators lay their eggs, then you can help start to think about what kinds of things can I do to attract pollinators that are looking for a place to lay their eggs. So this is our butterfly weed. It's a beautiful orange to yellow, Asclepias tuberosa. This is one of the few milkweeds that does not have a milky latex sap when you tweak off a leaf. Kind of interesting. But the monarch butterfly will seek out these milkweeds, lay an egg. The caterpillar or the larva that is developing from that egg will start to feed and chew on the leaves of this plant. And then generally speaking, the chrysalis stage, remember the pupal stage, that caterpillar will move to a different plant, generally speaking. It won't pupate on this plant. So other shrubs or small trees nearby would be suitable places suitable plants to plant in and around near these various milkweed species. So what do they feed on? Very, very quickly. Butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, and wasps, they feed on nectar. And pollen is generally not a very important source. Now, wasps are predators, so I can remember times sitting under a canopy and there are other insects and flies and such, and the wasp will come up and grab one of those flies and see the head will just fall. They're not predators because they're going to eat that. That insect that wasp just took, that will go right for protein for their larvae. The wasps are nectar feeders. So now the bees are actively gathering pollen. The pollen is going to be for their larvae. They need it's very high in protein. They may also mix a little bit of nectar in. And then the adults are just kind of the opposite. They may take a little bit of pollen for food, but mostly they're nectar feeders. Of course, the butterflies are going to be feeding on nectar, the moths, the flies, the beetles, all feeding on nectar. So some of the bees are very, very, very selective on which plants they visit. Some of them are generalists. They don't care. So some of the ones that we have in our area would be the mallow plants, the globe mallow. It's in the family Malvaceae. The hibiscus is in that same family. And for example, in our area, we have the bee genus Diadasia, which feeds primarily on, or pollinates and gets its nectar primarily on the Malvaceae. And some of the same species, or this genus, will forage for pollen on the Cactaceae. So this is their small bee Diadasia. You can see these specialized hairs for collecting pollen. And it's taking some nectar for its food, but it is collecting pollen just, because the hairs are going to be attracting it. And it's very, very specific to just a few major groups or families of plants. I've seen that in our yard here on our orange globe mallow. Beautiful blue eye. And sometimes not such a lucky day for the pollinators. But by providing lots of pollinators, you're going to be providing food for other invertebrates as well, and birds. So it just adds diversity and beauty in your landscaped environment. I mean, this is a beautiful spider, the crab spider. Okay, some of the bees. If you ever find a gourd or even a domestic squash in your garden, you get up in the morning and you look in there, you might see some of these squash bees, and they'll overnight in there. Some of these bee groups are just foraging on certain Cactaceae. A really interesting one are the kleptoparasites. They don't have these specialized hairs and structures, so they have to get pollen for their young in a different way. I think the kleptoparasite kind of gives you some idea. They're thieves. And the pollen thief will get into the nest area of this host bee, will lay an egg, and when the egg hatches, it'll kill the host's offspring or larvae and then feed on the pollen. So it's just another way, a different strategy to get the pollen to the larvae. This is kind of busy. You can take some time, but look at of these 4,000 bee species in North America, 90% of those are solitary. They're not like honeybees. They're not like bumblebees. They're living on their own. So a good proportion of these solitary bees, they dig tunnels into the ground. And they can be of various types. Some are complex and some are just tunnels in the ground. The other solitary bees, they use different strategies. They tunnel into wood. We're going to see some pictures here in a little bit so you can see what we're talking about of these dead, soft, pithy stems and twigs. Some in cracks or crevices, abandoned rodent dens, etc. And then the honeybees, which are not native to North America, they're European or African, which we're not talking about at all. I'm just talking about the native pollinators here. And bumblebees, which are very important. Elroy Limmer took this photograph. This is an old gate he had, and he took the hinges off, so there's a hole, and this solitary bee, female, is packing, probably tunneled down in, laid her eggs, sealed it up, and then the young bees are kind of off to fend for themselves. They'll develop egged larvae, chew their way out, pupate. So what we just looked at very, very fast, these different parts of a life cycle, different food preferences, areas where certain of these pollinators like to lay their eggs, all of these things you can use in your yard or your landscape project to develop some strategies or think about some strategies. So as you walk around your space in your garden, you can jot down some of the strategies that you might want to incorporate into an existing space, or really take some time and think about how many different strategies you can develop or devise that will attract and sustain these native pollinators. And then in the next video, we're going to look at some examples of specific strategies that we've just talked about, and then hopefully you'll come up with some of your own. On the discussion board, in the discussion area, you should ask some questions, take a couple pictures of something that might relate to what we just talked about. That might stimulate other students to sort of chime in and get some discussions going. I'll be monitoring, as will the other instructors, and we can just enhance our learning. Okay, on to the next one.